Give half to your sister-in-law, his mom ordered. I said, no. They laughed and burned the lottery ticket. You'll never see a dime. I poured tea and said nothing. They thought it ended there. They didn't see what I planted, what I triggered, or who would knock first. Payback didn't knock. It kicked the door iron. The kitchen clock read 3:47 p.m. when Joe burst through the front door, waving that cursed piece of paper like a flag of victory. I was folding laundry at the dining table, matching his socks with the methodical precision I'd perfected over 23 years of marriage. The sound of his footsteps thundering across the hardwood floor made me look up, and there it was, that lottery ticket clutched in his trembling fingers. We won, he shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. Sweet Jesus, we actually won. But Hannah was already there. She must have been lurking by the window again, watching for Joe's return from his Tuesday grocery run. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite it being a weekday afternoon, and she wore that predatory smile I'd come to despise. Before Joe could even explain the numbers, before he could tell me how much we'd won, her manicured hands were reaching for our ticket. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories of quiet strength and justice. If you believe that no one should endure family cruelty in silence, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. Let me see that, she purred, snatching it from Joe's grasp with the entitlement of someone who'd never worked a day in her life. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and I watched her expression shift from curiosity to pure greed. Oh my God, Joe. This is real. This is actually real. I stood up slowly, the sock I'd been holding falling to the floor. How much? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Hannah's laugh was sharp and cold. Enough to change everything, sister-in-law. Enough to change absolutely everything. That's when Elizabeth appeared. Joe's mother had a sixth sense for drama, and she glided into the room wearing her usual armor of disapproval and that floral dress she claimed made her look younger. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the wrinkles from her forehead, and her pale blue eyes immediately fixed on the ticket in Hannah's hands. Family meeting, Elizabeth announced, settling into the armchair that had become her unofficial throne since moving in with us 6 months ago. Living room. Now. We filed in like defendants approaching a judge. Joe sat on the couch, his initial excitement now replaced by nervous energy. Hannah perched on the armrest beside him, still clutching our winning ticket. I took my usual spot on the wooden chair by the window, the uncomfortable one nobody else wanted. Elizabeth studied us all with the calculating gaze of a chess master planning her next move. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. This is a family windfall, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. And family means sharing. My heart started to pound. I could feel where this was heading, could sense the trap closing around me before she even spoke the words. You'll give half to Hannah, Elizabeth continued, her lips curving into that smirk I'd learned to dread. She's family too. She deserves her share of this blessing. The words hit me like a physical blow. Half of our winnings from a ticket Joe and I had purchased together with our grocery money, should go to his sister who'd never contributed a single dollar to our household expenses? No, I said. The word escaped before I could stop it, clear and definitive in the suddenly quiet room. Hannah's laugh was like breaking glass. Excuse me. I said no. I looked directly at Elizabeth, then at Hannah, then finally at my husband. This is our ticket. Our money. Our choice. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed to slits. How dare you speak to me like that in my son's house? It's my house too, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I've been paying the mortgage alongside Joe for over 2 decades. Hannah stood up abruptly, the lottery ticket fluttering in her grip. You selfish witch. After everything this family has done for you, what exactly has this family done for me? The question hung in the air like smoke. Because from where I'm sitting, I'm the one who's cooked, cleaned, and cared for everyone else for years. That's when Hannah's mask slipped completely. She looked at the ticket in her hands, then at Elizabeth, then back at me. You know what? Fine. If you won't share willingly. She moved toward the fireplace before I could react. The gas logs weren't lit, but Elizabeth was already reaching for the matches on the mantel. The crystal matchbox, a wedding gift from my own mother, felt like a weapon in her arthritic hands. "Don't," I whispered, but it was too late. Elizabeth struck the match with ceremonial precision. The flame danced orange and gold, casting shadows across her satisfied face. "You should have been generous," she said. "Generosity is a virtue." Hannah held the ticket above the flame, and I watched 23 years of financial struggle and sacrifice curl into ash. They watched it burn like it was a celebration, like they were roasting marshmallows over a campfire instead of destroying my dreams. The paper blackened and crumbled, pieces floating down to the stone hearth like snow. Hannah clapped her hands together, brushing away the remaining fragments. "There," she said with finality. "You'll never see a dime." I walked to the kitchen in a daze, my feet moving without conscious direction. The teapot sat on the stove where I'd left it, and I filled it with water, my hands operating on autopilot. The familiar ritual of preparing tea grounded me, gave me something to focus on besides the rage building in my chest. When I returned to the living room with the tray, they were still there, still gloating. I poured 3 cups of Earl Grey with steady hands, adding sugar to Elizabeth's and cream to Hannah's, just the way they liked it. My face revealed nothing. My voice remained silent. But inside me something fundamental had shifted. Something had cracked wide open, and what filled the space wasn't despair or defeat. It was something sharper, something that tasted like metal and felt like lightning. They thought they'd won. They thought burning that ticket was the end of the story. They had no idea it was just the beginning. That night, after Joe had fallen asleep with his usual symphony of snores, I stood by our bedroom window looking out at the street where I'd lived for so many years. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking. I didn't cry. Tears were for the weak, for the defeated, for people who had no other options. Instead, I planned. Because the lottery ticket they'd burned so triumphantly? That wasn't the real one. I'd learned long ago never to trust this family with anything precious. The real ticket was safely hidden, and tomorrow I would begin the most important game of my life. They'd given me something more valuable than money today. They'd given me absolute clarity about who they really were and what I needed to do about it. The war had begun, and they didn't even know they were already losing. The morning after the burning, I woke before dawn with a clarity that surprised me. While Joe showered, humming an off-key tune as if nothing had changed, I sat at my vanity mirror applying lipstick with surgical precision. Today would be the first day of my new life, though nobody else would know it yet. At 9:15 a.m. I called Hartwell and Associates from the phone in our bedroom, my voice steady as I scheduled an appointment. "I need to see someone today," I told the receptionist. "It's urgent but confidential." They squeezed me in at 11:30 a.m. Mr. Salim was nothing like the loud, flashy attorneys you see on television commercials. He was a small man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the sort of person who listened more than he spoke. His office smelled of leather and coffee, lined with law books that looked genuinely read rather than decorative. "How can I help you, Mrs. Patterson?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from his modest desk. I reached into my purse and pulled out the real lottery ticket, placing it carefully on the mahogany surface between us. His eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign of surprise he allowed himself. "This stays between us," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "Attorney-client privilege." He nodded slowly, studying the ticket. "This is quite substantial. May I ask why you're bringing this to me instead of the lottery office?" I told him everything. The family meeting, the demand to share, the burning of the decoy ticket I'd created months ago when I first started playing the same numbers. I'd learned to be careful with this family, to protect anything that mattered to me. "I need to claim this without anyone knowing," I explained. "Not yet. I have plans, Mr. Salim. Plans that require patience and precision." His smile was barely perceptible, but I caught it. "I think I understand. Let me make some calls." By the time I returned home, Elizabeth was holding court in my kitchen, regaling Mrs. Chin from next door with the story of yesterday's drama. Her voice carried that theatrical quality she reserved for her most satisfying gossip. "She's been sulking ever since," Elizabeth announced as I walked through the door. "Won't even look at us properly. Acting like a child who didn't get her way." I set my purse down and began preparing lunch, letting their words wash over me like background noise. Mrs. Chin made sympathetic sounds, but I caught her glancing at me with curiosity rather than pity. Some people just can't handle disappointment gracefully, Hannah added from her perch at the breakfast bar. She'd painted her nails a garish pink that morning, and they gleamed like tiny weapons as she gestured. I mean, we were trying to teach her about family values, you know? I turned to face them both, arranging my features into what I hoped looked like resigned sadness. You're right, I said quietly. I was being selfish. I'm sorry. Elizabeth's triumphant smile could have powered the neighborhood. Well, it's about time. Apology accepted, dear. Hannah laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Maybe next time you'll think twice before being so greedy. Though I suppose you're probably hoping for a refund from those ashes, aren't you? I managed a small, embarrassed smile. Something like that. The lie tasted like copper on my tongue, but their satisfaction was intoxicating. They believed they'd broken me, reduced me to the apologetic doormat they'd always wanted me to be. Over the following days, I began my careful dance of deception. Every morning, I told Joe I was going to the library or the grocery store, but instead, I visited the bank where Mr. Salim had arranged for discreet meetings with their financial advisors. I opened accounts under my maiden name, Crawford, something I hadn't used in decades. The notary public on Elm Street became familiar with my face as I authenticated documents Mr. Salim prepared. An accountant named Patricia Williams helped me understand tax implications and legal structures. Each appointment was scheduled with military precision, timed to avoid any chance encounters with neighbors or family. At home I played my role perfectly. When Elizabeth mentioned her arthritis acting up, I brought her heating pads and aspirin. When Hannah complained about her car making strange noises, I suggested she ask Joe to take a look. I was the picture of domestic compliance, invisible in my usefulness. Joe remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. One evening as we sat watching the news, he reached over and patted my hand. I'm sorry about what happened, he said softly. With the ticket and all. They didn't mean to hurt you. Mom just gets worked up sometimes, and Hannah, well, you know how she is. I turned to study his face in the flickering light of the television. There was genuine concern there, mixed with the comfortable assumption that his apology would fix everything. He'd always been good at smoothing over family conflicts, at pretending ugly moments were just misunderstandings. I know, I replied, leaning over to kiss his forehead. Don't worry about it. The lies were becoming easier each day. I didn't hate Joe. That would have required more energy than he deserved. Instead, I found myself pitying him. He was a passenger in his own life, carried along by stronger currents without ever questioning their direction. That weekend, while the family attended Hannah's friend's baby shower, I made my most important visit yet. Elizabeth's bedroom had always been off limits, but desperate times called for bold measures. Her dresser drawers revealed a treasure trove of forgotten documents. Old loan agreements with signatures that didn't quite match her current handwriting. Bank statements from accounts she'd never mentioned. Credit card bills for purchases she'd claimed were gifts from mysterious benefactors. I photographed everything with the small digital camera Mr. Salim had suggested, being careful to leave no trace of my presence. Each document was a piece of ammunition, carefully catalogued and stored. The family safe in the den was my final stop. Elizabeth had used the same combination for years, Joe's birthday, because she'd never been creative about security. Inside, among the insurance papers and birth certificates, I placed my own contributions. Documents I'd carefully aged and modified, creating a paper trail that would raise questions at exactly the right moment. I labeled each edition with the meticulous care of a librarian, ensuring they'd be found when someone finally looked. The timeline I'd constructed was a masterpiece of misdirection, each date chosen to create maximum confusion and legal liability. As I closed the safe and spun the combination lock, I felt a deep satisfaction settle in my chest. The breadcrumbs were in place, leading not to safety, but to a reckoning that none of them saw coming. The whispers in the silence weren't their gossip about my supposed sulking. They were the sound of documents being filed, accounts being opened, and legal machinery beginning to turn. They thought they'd reduce me to ash just like that ticket. They had no idea they'd only made me stronger. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Elizabeth was getting her hair done and Hannah was at her yoga class. Mr. Salim's voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of satisfaction beneath the surface. It's done, Mrs. Patterson. The ticket has been processed through our trust arrangement. Clean, quiet, and completely legal. I gripped the phone tighter, standing in my empty kitchen with sunlight streaming through the window. After weeks of careful planning, the moment felt almost anticlimactic. No fanfare, no celebration, just the quiet transfer of numbers from one account to another. "How much?" I whispered, even though I was alone in the house. "After taxes and fees, you're looking at just over $2.3 million. The number hung in the air like a prayer answered. I'd known the rough amount from the ticket, but hearing it confirmed made my knees weak. I sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, the same one where I'd folded Joe's socks just weeks ago. "The account is established under Margaret Crawford, as we discussed," Mr. Salim continued. "Your mother's maiden name provides the necessary separation. The bank has no reason to connect it to your married identity." Margaret Crawford. I hadn't been Margaret Crawford in 23 years, but the name felt like putting on clothes that still fit perfectly. Margaret Crawford was single, independent, and owed nothing to anyone. "Thank you," I managed to say. "There's more," he added. "I've taken the liberty of setting up a secondary account for immediate expenses, and I have some property listings you might find interesting. Cash purchases, naturally. No mortgage applications, no credit checks, no paper trails leading back to Maple Street." That afternoon, I drove 45 minutes to the coast, to a small town called Seabrook that I'd only visited once before on a failed anniversary trip with Joe. The house Mr. Salim had found was tucked away on a quiet street lined with weathered cottages, most of them vacation rentals that sat empty during the off-season. Number 17 Anchor Lane was perfect in its simplicity. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with windows that looked out over dune grass toward the ocean. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Carol, met me there with keys and paperwork. "Cash sale, I understand?" she asked, trying not to look too excited about her commission. "Yes. I'd like to close as quickly as possible." "Well, that certainly makes things easier. The seller is motivated. It was his mother's place and he lives in California now. Never visits." I walked through the small rooms, imagining myself there. No family photos cluttering the mantel, no Elizabeth's disapproving glances, no Hannah's constant chatter. Just silence and the distant sound of waves. "I'll take it," I said. Carol blinked in surprise. "Don't you want to have it inspected?" "Think it over." "No. I've thought enough for one lifetime." The paperwork was signed that same day. Margaret Crawford bought herself a house by the sea, and nobody on Maple Street had any idea she existed. Returning home felt like stepping back into a costume I was growing tired of wearing. Elizabeth was in the living room, regaling Mrs. Chin with stories about her plans for the family's future. "We're looking at property," she announced grandly, gesturing with the teacup I'd filled for her. "Something bigger with better investment potential. Joe's always been too conservative with money, but I have vision." I stood in the doorway listening, sipping my own tea with what I hoped looked like polite interest. Mrs. Chin nodded enthusiastically, though I could see the skepticism in her eyes. She'd lived next door long enough to know exactly what Elizabeth's investments typically looked like. "Of course, we'll need to be strategic about timing," Elizabeth continued. "There are certain tax considerations, you understand. The government takes such a large bite these days." The irony was delicious. Elizabeth, who hadn't filed proper tax returns in 3 years, was lecturing about government overreach. I'd found the unpaid notices buried in her bedroom drawer, along with threatening letters from the state revenue department. She owed more than $12,000, plus penalties and interest. "That sounds wonderful," I said sweetly. "I'm sure you'll find exactly what you're looking for." Elizabeth beamed at me, pleased by my apparent support. "See, Mrs. Chin? I told you she'd come around. Family loyalty always wins in the end." The following week brought an unexpected development. Hannah burst through our front door clutching her phone and practically vibrating with excitement. "Look at this," she shrieked, shoving the device in my face. The screen displayed a photo of an elaborate white dress covered in crystals and beading. "It's beautiful," I said automatically, though it looked more like a costume than a wedding gown. "Isn't it? It's a Vera Wang and it's on sale for only $3,000. Can you believe it? Vera Wang." I made appropriately impressed sounds while she swiped through more photos. The dress was ridiculous, something a teenager might choose for prom, but Hannah was 28 and still believed more expensive meant better. "The wedding's in 6 months," she continued, settling onto the couch with the dramatic flair she'd perfected. Derek proposed last weekend. Can you believe it? I'm going to be Mrs. Derek Williamson. Derek was Hannah's boyfriend of 2 years, a soft-spoken accountant who seemed perpetually bewildered by her energy. I'd always wondered what he saw in her, but then again, love was rarely logical. Congratulations, I said. Have you set a date? October 15th. It'll be perfect. Fall colors, crisp air, gorgeous photos. She turned to me with a calculating look. You'll be out by then, won't you? The question caught me off guard. Out. Moved on. Dealt with your little breakdown about the lottery ticket. Found somewhere else to live, maybe? This house will be so much better for entertaining once it's just family. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Hannah wasn't just planning a wedding, she was planning my exile. In her mind, I was already gone, displaced by her vision of a perfect future where she and Derek could move into the house Joe and I had spent decades paying for. We'll see, I managed to say. Hannah's giggle was sharp as broken glass. Oh, don't worry. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're so resourceful. She had no idea how resourceful I'd become. While she was shopping for overpriced dresses and planning her fairy tale wedding, I was quietly building the foundation for her nightmare. The documents I'd planted would surface soon enough, and when they did, Hannah would discover that court appearances were much less glamorous than wedding ceremonies. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I allowed myself a small smile. Let them plan their property investments and dream weddings. Let them assume I'd simply fade away, disappearing like the smoke from their burned lottery ticket. They were about to learn that some fires burn much longer than expected, and the brightest flames are often the most dangerous. The money sitting in Margaret Crawford's account wasn't just freedom, it was fuel for the reckoning that was coming. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning at 8:23 a.m., slipped through our mail slot while we were all seated around the breakfast table. Elizabeth was complaining about the temperature of her scrambled eggs. Hannah was scrolling through wedding venue photos on her phone, and Joe was reading yesterday's sports section for the third time. I heard the soft thud of paper hitting the hardwood floor in the foyer, but I didn't move to retrieve it immediately. Let them finish their morning routines first. Let them have these last few moments of blissful ignorance. Mail's here, I announced casually, rising to collect the stack of envelopes. Bills, advertisements, a catalog for garden supplies, and one official-looking envelope with the State Revenue Department's return address. I carried it back to the table like a bomb with a lit fuse. This one's for you, Elizabeth, I said, placing the letter beside her orange juice glass. She glanced at it dismissively while buttering her toast. Probably another one of those surveys. They're always wanting to know about senior citizen spending habits. But when she tore open the envelope and unfolded the contents, her face went ashen. The toast dropped from her fingers, landing butter side down on the tablecloth. What is it, Mom? Joe asked, looking up from his newspaper. Elizabeth's voice came out as a whisper. Tax audit. They want to audit the house. Joe leaned forward, concern creasing his forehead. That doesn't sound right. We've always filed our taxes properly. I watched Elizabeth's hands tremble as she passed the letter to her son. The official letterhead seemed to glow under the kitchen's fluorescent lights, each word a small dagger aimed at the heart of their comfortable assumptions. Joe read aloud, his voice growing more strained with each sentence. Notice of Property Tax Assessment Review. Irregularities in reported ownership. Discrepancies in financial documentation. Required to appear. Elizabeth's teacup slipped from her grasp, shattering against the ceramic tile floor in an explosion of Earl Grey and bone china. The sound made Hannah look up from her phone for the first time all morning. What's wrong with you people? She snapped. It's just a stupid letter. I knelt to collect the broken pieces, my movements deliberate and unhurried. The largest fragment had Elizabeth's name painted in delicate script along the rim, a gift from Joe's late father. How fitting that it should break today. It's not just a letter, Joe said, his voice tight with worry. It's a full audit. They want to examine all the property records, loan documents, ownership transfers from the past 5 years. Hannah finally put down her phone. So what? We don't have anything to hide. The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth stared at the letter as if it might change its contents through sheer force of will. Joe ran his hands through his thinning hair, a gesture I recognized from every crisis we'd weathered together. Elizabeth, I said gently, rising from the floor with a handful of broken china. Are there any documents you might have forgotten about? Old loans, maybe? Property agreements. Her eyes darted toward the den where the family safe was hidden behind a painting of lighthouse. I don't think so. I mean, there might be some old paperwork, but nothing important. The lie sat between us like a third person at the table. I'd seen those documents, photographed them, carefully catalogued every signature and date. Elizabeth had borrowed against the house twice without telling Joe, using forged consent forms that bore his signature. Signatures I'd practiced copying for weeks. We should probably get a lawyer, Joe said. Someone who knows about tax law. Lawyers are expensive, Elizabeth protested. Maybe it's just a random audit. They probably picked our address out of a hat. I dumped the broken china into the trash can, each piece landing with a satisfying clink. I could ask around. See if anyone knows a good accountant. The truth was, I already knew exactly which accountant they'd need. Patricia Williams, the same woman who'd helped me understand the labyrinthine tax implications of my lottery winnings. She was thorough, honest, and would spot Elizabeth's irregularities within minutes of opening the first file. Over the next few days, more letters arrived. Each one felt like another nail in their coffin. The bank wanted to verify ownership documents for accounts Elizabeth had claimed were gifts from distant relatives. The state wanted proof of income for property taxes that had been mysteriously reduced 3 years running. Hannah received her first official notice on Friday afternoon. She'd driven over to show Elizabeth fabric samples for her wedding reception tablecloths when the courier knocked on our door. Hannah Morrison? The courier asked, checking his clipboard. That's me, she said, signing for the envelope with her usual flourish. But her smile died when she opened it. The legal letterhead seemed to drain the color from her face as she read the contents. This is impossible, she whispered, then louder. This is impossible. Joe looked up from his newspaper. What now? They say I'm co-owner of 2 business accounts I've never heard of. Seaside Property Holdings and Coastal Investment Partners. They want me to appear for questioning about suspicious financial activity. Elizabeth snatched the letter from Hannah's hands, her eyes scanning the official text with growing panic. This is a mistake. You've never owned any business accounts. Of course I haven't. Hannah's voice rose to a shriek. I work part-time at a boutique. I don't even have a savings account with more than $300. I continued folding laundry at the dining room table, listening to their panic with the calm attention of someone watching a movie. The accounts in question were indeed fictional, carefully constructed paper trails that would lead investigators down rabbit holes of manufactured evidence. Did you touch any family accounts? Joe asked me suddenly, his eyes wild with suspicion. The question hung in the air like smoke. I met his gaze directly, my expression calm and truthful. No, I said simply. I never touched your family's accounts. It was the absolute truth. I had never touched their accounts. I had created entirely new ones, used their identities to establish credit lines they didn't know existed, and built a web of financial connections that would take investigators months to untangle. That evening, as the family huddled around the kitchen table trying to make sense of their legal troubles, another courier arrived. This time the envelope was thicker, more official, bearing the seal of the county courthouse. Hannah's name was printed in bold letters across the front. She opened it with shaking hands, and when she read the contents, the sound that escaped her throat was barely human. Pure terror, raw and primal. Court summons, she gasped. They want me to appear next month for financial fraud investigation. Elizabeth's hand slammed against the table with such force that the salt shaker jumped. This is insane. We're being targeted. Someone is doing this to us. I rose quietly and began clearing the dinner dishes, stacking plates with the same methodical precision I'd used to stack the evidence against them. Their voices rose and fell around me like a storm I was watching from inside a shelter. Hannah screamed. Elizabeth cursed. Joe demanded answers that none of them had. And I simply washed the dishes, dried them carefully, and put them away in their proper places. The papers had screamed their accusations across official letterhead, and the sound was more beautiful than any symphony I'd ever heard. Tomorrow would bring more letters, more questions, more cracks in the foundation of their comfortable lies. But tonight I would sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. I woke to the sound of Elizabeth screaming into her phone at exactly 6:47 a.m. the next Tuesday. Her voice carried through the thin walls like a siren, each word sharp with panic and disbelief. "What do you mean frozen?" she shrieked. "That's my pension. That's my grocery money. You can't just freeze someone's accounts without warning." I lay in bed listening to her plead with the bank representative, her tone shifting from outrage to desperation as the conversation continued. Through the bedroom wall, I could hear Joe stirring beside me, muttering complaints about the early morning disturbance. "What's she yelling about now?" he mumbled, rolling over to check the alarm clock. "Bank trouble, it sounds like," I replied, stretching as if I'd just awakened naturally. The shouting continued for another 10 minutes before Elizabeth's voice broke entirely. I heard her footsteps stomping down the hallway, followed by the slam of her bedroom door. The silence that followed was somehow more ominous than the screaming had been. At breakfast, Elizabeth sat at the table like a broken marionette, her usually perfect hair disheveled and her face puffy from crying. She stared at her untouched oatmeal as if it held answers to questions she couldn't formulate. "They froze everything," she whispered. "My checking account, my savings, even my pension deposits. They say it's all under review pending the investigation." Joe set down his coffee cup so hard it sloshed onto the morning paper. "How is that legal? They can't just take your money without proof of wrongdoing." "Apparently they can." Elizabeth's voice was hollow. "The representative said something about suspicious activity patterns and potential fraud indicators. They won't even tell me what specific activity triggered the freeze." I buttered my toast with careful precision, each stroke of the knife deliberate and calm. "Did you call a lawyer like we discussed?" Elizabeth's laugh was bitter and sharp. "I tried. Called Henley and Associates, you know, the firm that handled your uncle's estate. But they won't take the case. Said they had a conflict of interest." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. Henley and Associates was indeed where Mr. Salim had worked before starting his own practice. Small world, smaller coincidences. "There are other lawyers," Joe offered weakly. "With what money?" Elizabeth snapped. "My accounts are frozen, remember? I can't even access my own funds to hire legal help." The irony was exquisite. Elizabeth, who had burned my lottery ticket to teach me about family values, was now learning about the value of liquid assets. That afternoon brought fresh devastation. Joe came home from work looking like he'd seen a ghost, clutching a manila envelope that trembled in his hands. "They came to my office," he said, collapsing onto the living room sofa. "Federal investigators. Asked questions about loans I supposedly signed for. Showed me documents with my signature on them." He pulled papers from the envelope with shaking fingers. "Look at this. A second mortgage on the house, dated 3 years ago. $47,000. I never signed this. I never even saw this before today." I examined the document he thrust at me, though I already knew every word by heart. Elizabeth's handiwork was impressive. The signature was a nearly perfect forgery of Joe's careful script. Nearly perfect, but not quite. The investigators would spot the inconsistencies soon enough. "It's not possible," Joe said, his voice breaking. "I would never take out a loan without discussing it with you. You know I wouldn't do that." "I know," I said softly, placing my hand over his. "Someone must have forged your signature." His eyes found Elizabeth, who was pretending to read a magazine in the corner chair. "Mom, do you know anything about this?" Elizabeth's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally, defensive anger. "How dare you accuse me? I'm your mother. I would never forge your signature." But her protest rang hollow and we all knew it. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. By Thursday, Hannah had packed 3 suitcases and moved them into Derek's apartment across town. She arrived at dinner time to announce her decision, her usual dramatics replaced by genuine fear. "I can't stay here anymore," she declared, standing in our doorway like a refugee. "This house is cursed. Everything that happens here turns to disaster." "Running away won't solve anything," Elizabeth said, though her own voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not, but staying here definitely won't solve anything either." Hannah's phone buzzed in her pocket, and when she glanced at the screen, her face went white. "They want me to come in for questioning again tomorrow. About the accounts I supposedly own." "Just tell them the truth," Joe suggested. Explain that you've never heard of those businesses. Hannah's laugh was hysterical. The truth? The truth is that somehow my name is on bank documents I never signed, for companies I never heard of, managing money I never saw. How do you explain that kind of truth? She left without saying goodbye, her heels clicking rapidly down the front walkway as if she were being chased. That evening, as I prepared dinner, Elizabeth appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her usual composure had cracked completely, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. "This is your fault," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Ever since that lottery ticket business, everything has gone wrong. You did this somehow." I continued stirring the soup, my movements steady and unhurried. "Did what, Elizabeth? Don't play innocent with me. I know you're behind this. You and your mysterious errands, your secret phone calls. You've been planning something." She stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that would have intimidated the old me. But the old me had died the day she burned that ticket. "You laughed first," I said quietly, not looking up from the stove. "And I poured the tea, remember? I kept my mouth shut and cleaned up your messes just like always." "You think you're so clever," Elizabeth spat. "But whatever game you're playing, it won't work. The truth always comes out." I finally turned to face her, meeting her wild eyes with perfect calm. "You're absolutely right, Elizabeth. The truth always comes out. That's exactly what's happening." Friday brought the news that Elizabeth's pension review had been suspended indefinitely. Hannah's phone was confiscated as evidence in the ongoing financial investigation. Joe received a letter informing him that his credit score had dropped by 200 points overnight due to the mysterious loan defaulting. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Chin stopped bringing over her homemade cookies. The mailman lingered longer than necessary, obviously curious about the official envelopes that arrived daily. The family that had once been the social center of Maple Street became the whispered cautionary tale. I watched it all unfold from my position of invisible stability. While their world crumbled, I maintained the household routines that had anchored my life for decades. I cooked meals, cleaned surfaces, paid bills. Bills I could now afford thanks to Margaret Crawford's growing bank account. At night, when the house finally quieted and Joe lay beside me tossing restlessly in his sleep, I would stand at the bedroom window and look out at the street where I'd lived for so many years. The streetlights cast the same shadows they always had, but everything felt different now. The empire they'd built on assumptions and casual cruelty was collapsing exactly as I'd designed it to. Each falling piece had been carefully placed, each consequence precisely calculated. And tomorrow would bring even more beautiful destruction. The auction notice appeared in the local paper on a crisp October morning, exactly 6 months after that first letter arrived. Court-ordered sale, 42 Maple Street. I read it while sipping coffee on my new porch, the ocean breeze carrying the scent of salt and freedom through my kitchen window. The house that had been my prison for 23 years would be sold to the highest bidder in 30 days. Joe had called me the night before, his voice broken and pleading, but I'd already disconnected my old phone number. Margaret Crawford didn't need to hear Joe Patterson's apologies. I'd moved into the cottage the week after Hannah's phone was confiscated, slipping away quietly while they were all distracted by their legal troubles. The moving truck came at dawn, and by the time they realized I was gone, I was already 45 minutes away, unpacking boxes in rooms that smelled of sea air instead of disappointment. My new mailbox read, Crawford, in simple black letters. A name that felt like coming home after a long, exhausting journey. The postal worker who delivered to Anchor Lane was a chatty woman named Ruth who brought my mail with genuine smiles and updates about the local fishing boats. She never asked questions about my past, never wondered why a woman my age had suddenly appeared in the cottage that had sat empty for years. The first check from Hannah's garnished wages arrived on a Tuesday. $67.32. Deducted from her paycheck at the discount clothing store where she now worked folding polyester blouses for $9 an hour. The court had ordered her to repay the fraudulent business accounts I'd created in her name, accounts that totaled just over $40,000 once penalties and interest were added. She'd been forced to take a second job cleaning office buildings after midnight, trading her manicured nails for rubber gloves and industrial disinfectant. The wedding dress photos had disappeared from her social media, replaced by posts about temporary setbacks and building character through adversity. Derek had postponed their engagement indefinitely, claiming he needed time to process, the legal complications. I kept the checks in a small wooden box on my kitchen counter, not because I needed the money, but because each one represented justice measured in precise dollar amounts. Hannah's signature had grown shakier with each payment, the confident flourishes of her youth replaced by the careful economy of someone who could no longer afford dramatic gestures. Elizabeth's situation provided its own particular satisfaction. Her cousin Marjorie lived in a tiny apartment across town, where every surface was covered with doilies and the air smelled perpetually of mothballs and regret. Marjorie had strict house rules. No visitors after 8 p.m., no television during meals, and absolutely no tea service after 6 o'clock. Elizabeth, who had once held court in my kitchen every morning, now sat in Marjorie's cramped living room drinking instant coffee from chipped mugs. The woman who had burned my lottery ticket now lived by someone else's schedule, someone else's rules, someone else's mercy. The few mutual acquaintances we still shared reported that Elizabeth looked older, smaller somehow, as if the loss of her domain had physically diminished her. She'd applied for part-time work at the local grocery store, the same store where she'd once complained about slow service and incompetent cashiers. Joe's visit came on a gray November afternoon when the cottage windows rattled with wind from an approaching storm. I saw his car pull into my driveway and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just the mild curiosity of someone watching a stranger approach. He looked exhausted as he climbed my porch steps, his hair grayer than I remembered, his shoulders curved inward as if he were carrying invisible weight. He knocked softly, almost apologetically, and when I opened the door, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside to let him enter, noting how his gaze swept over the cottage's simple furnishings, the fresh flowers on the kitchen table, the peace that radiated from every corner of my new life. "Coffee," I offered, falling back on the hospitality I'd practiced for decades. "Please." We sat at my small table overlooking the dunes, the silence stretching between us like an ocean. Finally Joe spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me? About the real ticket, about your plans, about any of it?" I studied his face, searching for the man I'd once loved beneath the stranger he'd become. "Would you have believed me if I'd tried to explain what your family was really like?" "I might have." "No, Joe. You wouldn't have. You never saw what they did to me because you never wanted to see it. You preferred the comfortable fiction that we were all one happy family." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I loved you. I still love you. You loved the version of me that made your life easier. The one who cooked and cleaned and kept quiet when your mother was cruel. The one who smiled when your sister mocked me. You were never the target," I continued, my voice gentle but firm. "But you were never the shield either. You stood by and watched them burn what they thought was my future, and you did nothing to stop it." Tears ran down his cheeks now, and I felt something that might have been pity. Joe wasn't evil like Elizabeth or cruel like Hannah. He was simply weak. A man who'd chosen the path of least resistance for so long that he'd forgotten how to choose anything else. "I miss you," he whispered. "I know. But missing someone and deserving them back are two different things." He left as the first drops of rain began to fall, his car disappearing down Anchor Lane like a ghost returning to wherever ghosts belong. That evening I sat on my porch wrapped in a thick quilt, listening to the storm rage across the water. In my lap, I held the envelope that contained the receipt from the real lottery ticket, proof of the transaction that had changed everything. I'd never needed their apologies or their acknowledgement of what they'd done. I'd simply needed them to experience the same powerlessness I'd felt that day when they'd laughed over the ashes of what they thought was my only chance at freedom. The lottery ticket they'd burned had been worthless paper, a decoy I'd created from an old ticket and careful forgery. But their laughter that day had been real, their cruelty genuine, their dismissal of my worth absolute. Now they understood what it felt like to watch your world burn while others held the matches. The storm passed by midnight, leaving the air clean and salt-sweet. I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, the same blend I'd served them for years, and sipped it slowly as the stars emerged from behind the clearing clouds. Tomorrow would bring new mail, new chapters, new possibilities in a life that finally belonged entirely to me. The ashes they'd created had indeed bloomed into roses, just not the way any of us had expected. If this story of calculated revenge had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when she calmly poured tea while they burned what they thought was her future, not knowing the real ticket was safely hidden. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.